Hey, what is up, everyone? Thanks for joining me on this video today. Kind of a random topic that I wanted to talk about today, just really all about the quality of being unreasonable. I think a lot of us in our day to day lives are kind of steered towards being reasonable and making smart decisions, doing things where, you know, there's limited risk, things will ultimately end up being okay. There will be a certain amount of benefit with a certain amount of risk, and you need to properly align those two and properly, have the balance between those two in order to find some level of success, some level of stability, and some level of, just success in daily life and in your career and in your love life and really every aspect of life. You are kind of incentivized to include reasonability into the equation. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think for 80-90% of people, that's going to be the way to go. Being reasonable, doing things by the book, because we live in a world where every modern convenience is available to you, and we can take that for granted. We can assume that because we have those things, because these things have been invented, climate controlled environments, heating, air conditioning in our living spaces, indoor plumbing, electricity, Wi-Fi, gaming systems, computers, music, speakers, and all these different things, all these things that we enjoy every day and use. And because those exist, because those contraptions and features have been brought into existence, we can assume that everyone has these things and that everyone's life is like our life, and we live a pretty good life. We complain and we have long work days. Maybe we don't sleep too well, and maybe we eat shitty food, that type of thing. But overall, we are living the highest form of existence that has existed up until this point in human history. Now, this is someone who lives in the West, in the U.S., but I think that for most of the modern world, these things apply. And so, as far as how this relates to reasonability, the quality of being reasonable, I would say we assume that everyone has these things. But that's not the case. We live in an economy, a world economy, and one of the root words for economy is the Latin or Greek word for lack. So there basically needs to be someone in lack, someone needing something, and someone with a surplus of that thing for any of this really to work. Now, when you Google that and you try to find that exact definition, it's a bit hairy. It'll say that that's not the definition, but it says that word is the word for lack in Greek. And so I do think that if that was more widely known, more people would have an issue with the idea of an economy in the first place. But that's neither here nor there. That is so abstract that I want to stay on topic here, which is reasonability. So the reason that I bring that up with homeless people and people not even having access to the things that we consider basic, the modern world. You have homeless people in 2025 who don't have a phone, who don't have Wi-Fi, who don't have heating, cooling, air conditioning, indoor plumbing, things that we've had now for hundreds of years in some cases, but they still don't have these things because in this world, in this society, you can slip through the cracks if you're not taking reasonable and smart and safe steps. And so that's why I say for 80-90% of people, this reasonable disposition is going to serve you well. That's going to be the best place for you to operate from because maybe you're not capable of making calculated, unreasonable decisions or reevaluating your relationship with being reasonable in the first place. But if you are that other 10-20% who can handle a bit more risk, who can be more, high risk, high reward, who can operate under those circumstances, I encourage you to reevaluate your relationship with being reasonable. Okay? Because everyone tells you to be reasonable, but if you really look at the lives of these people who are telling you to be reasonable, if you really evaluate them, do you like what you see? Is that person, living a life that you are envious of, a life that you would enjoy having, or are they living a life that isn't really all that special, or they're still trying to make ends meet, or they're complaining about basic things in their life that they have the ability to control, but they don't because they want to be reasonable and they want to stay on the straight and narrow. They want to be safe and be reasonable and live their life and live it exactly how they've been told to live it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what I think and where I'm coming from is that someone's idea of what's reasonable is not necessarily the objective, level of reasonability, if you will. That's not like, they're not the compass, this person, even if it's your parents, telling you this, they're not the, the end all be all. They, more than anyone else in this world, want success for you. They have everything to gain from your success. And so definitely take them at their word. Believe, what they say. But as far as like other people in your life, like a manager or like even your friends, like they may not be thinking the same way that you're thinking. They may not understand what you're trying to do, where you're coming from, where you're trying to go, because they themselves don't think that they could do it. They don't think that it's reasonable for them, so they're going to say that it's not reasonable for you. And while they also have the best intentions at heart, sometimes people don't. Sometimes people are upset with their inability to overcome the reasonability that's been so deeply ingrained to them in their upbringing that they're now upset seeing someone else do unreasonable things and having it work for them, and then they're seeing a new level of success, a new life unfold in front of them because they decided to not let being reasonable be their main compass. They're not letting that decide the entire direction of their life. It's one thing to consider being reasonable, to understand what a reasonable action would look like, and then it's another thing to understand situations where being a bit more unreasonable can actually be a benefit. I'll give you an example. So if you're working like a sales position where you need to make a lot of calls, you might think making 10 to 20 calls is reasonable. You're in the office, you see other guys, they're making 10 to 20 calls, they're doing pretty good, they're making a couple sales every month, paying their bills, maybe they got a little extra, they go out on the weekends and they spend it up. Okay. 10 to 20 calls, that's all I got to do. That's reasonable. I can clock in 9, get out at 3, it's still a nice day, I can go have a drink on the patio, whatever it may be. You're acting reasonably, you're acting within the confines of the people around you, what they're doing, and you're evaluating all this, and you're deciding that this is a reasonable level of action, and I'm going to take this. Contrast that with someone who sees the quote-unquote reasonable level of action, the 10 to 20 calls on whatever it is that you're selling. They say, yeah, I get that, but I want more. I want to do 40 to 50 calls. I want to do 50 to 100 calls, whatever it may be. And, you have everyone else in the office who is accustomed to this level of action, to this level of, motivation, to this level of success, okay? They're used to this. They have this down pat. They've been doing this for years. They show up at this time. They make these calls. They get this amount of money, and then they go home at this time. You are deciding to be more unreasonable by deciding to take a higher level of calls, to make a higher level of calls, and to increase the baseline of what is expected. Not only in calls, but also in effort, maybe time spent in the office. Maybe even now you're starting to raise the bar for what sales can look like and what success can look like in your environment. Now you're looking at, 40 to 50 calls a day, and now you're looking at, 4 to 5 sales a month. Now you're living a little bit better than your coworkers, and maybe you're going out even more, or you're saving the money, you're not going out, whatever you're doing. You are taking what would be considered an unreasonable level of action in your career, and now you're seeing unreasonable results. And we want those unreasonable results. Okay, we don't want reasonable results. We don't want numbers that we can look at on the paper and say, yeah, these do make sense. Yeah, this is about right. This is in line with what I've been saying before. Now you want unreasonable levels. You're like, oh my gosh, where are these numbers coming from? Like, how are we doing so good? And you start to realize that it's that unreasonable level of action. And ultimately, it's all relative as far as reason goes. Reasonability, that is. It's all relative. And it really just comes as a result of time going by, people doing things a certain way, and usually I would say that it follows a descending trend line. People tend to kind of like to see how they can make the most out of the least, if that makes sense. Like they're gonna try to be more proficient, or efficient, if you will. They're gonna try to get, instead of getting 5 calls, or 5 sales in 50 calls, they're going to try to make 5 sales in 25 calls. They're not going to try to make 10 sales in 50 calls. They're not going to try to double that. They're going to try to do this, like, get the same results by doing less work. It's being more productive, you could say. So being reasonable generally follows a descending trend line where people try to be more reasonable, try to be more productive, more efficient, but they don't do it generally in a way that expands, because people are being more and more reasonable and thinking that, getting the same with less effort is where you want to be. But if you can put in more effort and get more results, then that's, I think, where you want to be. Because most people are trying to figure out how to make the most out of the least. What I'm trying to do is how to make the most out of the most and worry about what to do with that later. Okay? I want to do unreasonable actions. I want to redefine what my relationship is with being reasonable, what a reasonable life looks like. Who's to say that even 8 hours of working is reasonable? It could be more. That could be less. Also, 9 to 5 work week was kind of, brought to popularity by Henry Ford, and, they were able to find that 8 hour, 5 days a week was kind of the sweet spot. The 40-hour work week was kind of the best way to go. And so, maybe that's not the best way. Maybe it is. But the fact that we've all just decided that 8 hours is the most reasonable time to work because of what was stated, many, many years ago is interesting in and of itself. But ultimately, what I would like to see and what I'm trying to see in my own life is not that I am more reasonable. It is understanding the subjectivity of reasonability itself. Because if you're acting unreasonable, that might be a bad thing. You might be doing something detrimental to yourself and to your success and to those around you, and the people who are close to you might try to steer you in a better direction. But you can also be unreasonable in stuff that's really good. You can be unreasonable in the amount of times you check in on your friends, see how they're doing. You can be unreasonable in the amount of attempts you try to make a perfect souffle, whatever it may be. You can be unreasonable, like we said earlier, about the amount of calls that you make on a prospect, the amount of leads you gather, the amount of offers you make, the amount of presentations you make, the amount of proposals you make, whatever it may be. Being unreasonable in those situations will treat you well. It will improve your circumstances. And so, while it is important to be reasonable in a lot of situations, and in some situations, it's better to be reasonable 100% of the time, because, if you can't handle being a little bit unreasonable, you can't handle that level of risk in those situations, then be reasonable. But if you want more, don't be afraid to be unreasonable.